Here we got a few example problems from page P12 of our book. We're adding and subtracting integers. And you're probably looking at this point thinking, wow, this is really silly, this is really easy, it's really basic, but believe it or not, this is where we have the most common mistakes. So I really advise you to stick around and listen to this video. Shouldn't take too long. We're going to go ahead and get started on the first problem right here. Before we do though, I advise that at this time you go ahead and pause, write these down so you can take notes along with me. You can pause the video at any time, of course, rewind, fast forward, etc. So getting started with this first problem, -8 plus 13. You can rearrange problems, rearrange numbers, but you have to do it a specific way. If you have the number 8, the sign right before it always indicates if it's positive or negative, not the sign after. So this 8 is not a positive, it is a negative. Just like this 13 is not a negative, it's a positive because there's a plus in front. So the 8 is a negative and the 13 is a positive. If you wanted to rewrite this problem, you could rewrite it with the positive 13 first plus a negative 8. When you add a negative, that's the same thing as subtracting. So that's the same thing as 13 minus 8. You see what I just did there? I switched the numbers. Instead of -8 plus 13, I took my positive 13 first, and we're not adding because the number in front, the sign in front is a negative, we're going to be subtracting. So adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting. That's very important. That's a very common mistake that's made. 13 minus 8, you go ahead and plug it into your calculator. Your answer is going to be 5. So there's your final answer for that one. For the next one, I'm actually going to have to use a calculator for this one. So we have -77 plus -46. Well, remember in the previous example, I said plus negative is the same thing as subtracting. -77 minus 46. You could plug that into your calculator, but there are some calculators that don't have a negative. So here's what you can do. Notice how the 77 is a negative because there's a negative in front, and the 46 is a negative, so we have a negative in front. In your calculator, you can type in 77 positive plus 46. Your answer will be the same number, except it'll be a negative. And here's why. This is something that we're not going to do for a long time, but I'm going to go ahead and show you. Because both of these numbers have a negative in front, we can factor out a negative. So when we factor out something, we bring it to the outside and we create a set of parentheses. And that's the same thing as 77 plus 46. You add those two numbers up, so I'm going to add them up in my calculator, 77 plus 46. And I'm going to get 123. But because these are both negatives, because we took out a negative, our answer is actually negative 123. And that's very important. So if you don't understand this part, that's fine. But I want you to understand this. If on a number line you were at -77, by subtracting, you're moving further to the left because left indicates negative, right indicates positive. So by subtracting a negative from a negative number, this number is going to get bigger. So it's the same thing as adding those numbers, but our answer will be a negative. It's a very common mistake made, believe it or not, in algebra. That's why I'm going over this stuff. So this problem, this next problem right here, is set up kind of like this problem after we switched it, except the bigger number is negative. Because there's a negative number or negative symbol before the 82, this is a negative. This is something that we can actually type into our calculator. Now, because this is a positive number and this is a negative number, the negative number is bigger. It's the same thing as subtracting 82 minus 50, and that's the negative version of our answer. But we don't have to get too much into that. We can just type this into our calculator because that's nice and easy. 50 minus 82, and we get -32. However, like I said, and I'll go ahead and I'll write it over here in a different color. It's the same thing as if you were to have 82 minus 50. Almost like we were to distribute out a negative like we did before, and we would still end up with a negative 32. So distributing out a negative here, same thing as what we did here. So that's a little trick. If you don't have negatives in your calculators, you got to understand how these positive and negatives work. So let's go ahead and continue with the next problem. Negative 19 minus 8. We've already talked about subtracting a negative with a negative. It's the same thing as adding 19 plus 8, but we're going to end up with a negative answer. So I'm actually going to type in 19 plus 8 into my calculator to get 27. So according to this, my answer is 27 because I don't have a negative symbol on my calculator. But notice how they're both negatives. Don't forget that 27 now has to be a negative as a result. And last but not least, what I did was I just took this problem and I copied it because the most common mistake, and I'm at the very end of the year in algebra right now as I'm making this video, we're still going over this error. So this is very important that you study this and that you practice this. When you minus a negative, when you subtract a negative, I'm going to go ahead and do this one in red because it's the most important of all. It is the same thing as adding. Because in math, 2 wrongs make a right. When you subtract a negative, here's what happens. Subtracting moves you left on the number line, but when you subtract a negative, it flips you in the other direction. Moving right is the same thing as adding. So negative 19 plus 8 is going to give us negative 11. That is the most important answer of them all.